Our next teacher is a researcher in privacy and information security, decentralized networks, surveillance, and Bitcoin. She's currently experimenting with a model for open source, censorship-resistant online investigative journalism called revision-controlled journalism. It's my great pleasure to introduce Janine Römer, everyone.
So, hi everyone. Welcome to my session, and as Andrea said, I'm an investigative journalist, mostly focusing on topics like Bitcoin, information security, privacy, surveillance, and whistleblowing. And I know it's now the end of the first day, and many of you are probably getting sleepy, not only because it's the end of the day, but many of you came from places that are not a mile high. And so for the next 45 minutes or so, I'll get your heart pumping a little bit as we go through ways that you are being watched, surveilled, and targeted from all around the world. Are you awake yet? Good. So the title of my session, Bitcoin Privacy, is a bit of a misnomer because, as many of you know, the Bitcoin blockchain is public. And in order to achieve some privacy while using Bitcoin, you need to transact in ways that increase uncertainty in and the computational cost of singling you out amongst other users in the ecosystem. So that is mostly what privacy will mean today. However, towards the end of the session, I'll mention some exciting proposals that will positively impact the state of privacy in Bitcoin in the near future and make it much easier to achieve. And in some cases, in that instance, privacy will actually mean something hidden. So what is Bitcoin privacy? As Arjen Kempfus said in an interview a few years ago, he's a Dutch cybersecurity expert, a false sense of security can be worse than having no security at all, and the same applies to privacy. None of the tools that I will mention today are a one-size-fits-all ultimate solution. In fact, many of them can be rendered ineffective if you don't use them properly or don't use them in combination with other tools. But before we look more closely at tools and strategies that will give you better privacy, I think we should go over some important conceptual and philosophical perspectives about what privacy means in relation to Bitcoin. So would anyone in the audience be able to tell me where this paragraph comes from? I hope you are all familiar with it. That's correct. It's from Satoshi Nakamoto's white paper, and in this section, Satoshi wrote about what Bitcoin offered that the traditional financial system didn't in terms of privacy, despite the drawback, of course, of all transactions being publicly visible on the blockchain. And there are two strategies that Satoshi stressed in these paragraphs, and to this day I think they remain some of the most essential advice. The first piece of advice, which I underlined, and he even creates a diagram to illustrate this, is that true or legal identity should be segregated from the system. In traditional finance, including and even especially on the internet, they rely on third parties to gatekeep your transactions, always collecting some personally identifying information in order to allow you to transact. But since Bitcoin was intended as a permissionless system, identity should be left out of that equation because it is not necessary most of the time. Of course, the multitude of crypto banks that are popping up all around the world are trying very hard to make you think otherwise. The second piece of advice that he gave is about address reuse. Now, of course, Satoshi didn't use the word address in the white paper because at the time when the white paper was published, Bitcoin actually didn't use addresses yet. In fact, there was even a time where people were sending Bitcoin to each other via their IP addresses, which was quite bad, and luckily most of you were probably spared from that if you came into the industry a lot later. So don't reuse your addresses if you can help it, because it is one of the most basic steps that you can take to improve your privacy because so many people are doing it. And you should also choose wallets that encourage you not to do that. Sarah Jamie Lewis, who is the executive director of Open Privacy Research Society, who is the sponsor of the lanyards, the privacy lanyards, frequently stresses that privacy is about consent, and therefore you should have the option to refuse or withdraw your consent if you feel that any interaction may be violating your privacy. Financial privacy is, of course, part of this, and we need to understand that there are people who live under very different circumstances from many of us in this room and who need these tools even more badly than we do. So even if you aren't personally invested in protecting your financial life, even with cryptocurrencies, because your particular community or government doesn't carry the same risks for you yet, you should think about whether your participation and support could help someone whose life does depend on this system remaining permissionless and privacy enhancing. Trusted third parties are security holes, as Nick Szabo says very often, and James Lopp, who is a fellow teacher at this event, has written a lot about his experience with having to secure his personal life after he narrowly avoided a potentially deadly swatting incident. For anyone who doesn't know what swatting is, you can ask the hopefully friendly American in your vicinity. One of the things he said in a blog post was that my primary takeaway after countless hours of research is that we give a lot of personal information to many different merchants and service providers that are vulnerable to hacking and social engineering. And so you should assume that over a long enough period of time, any data you give third parties will be made public. Whether it happens intentionally is irrelevant. And so your options for not falling into this trap are give them nothing, give them only what is absolutely necessary, and when the opportunity arises, give them false data. For example, if you're buying an ebook, there is no reason to give them your real name and address because it's a digital object that doesn't need to be shipped. There is no way for you to defraud them by doing so, so it's not illegal. Last but not least, this is a rather old quote from two co-founders of the thwart project, and it goes along with what I was just saying about being a participant in these types of systems, even if your life does not depend on it. They said security is collaboration between multiple people. In order to protect your own security, you need to make sure that the system you use is not only usable by yourself, but the other participants as well. And in reality, the usability of several of the tools that I will talk about today, they're not as usable as they need to be for the average person, but hopefully, if you are one of those people, the burden on you will not be as heavy in the future. Until then, that's why I'm here, and that's why UX developers are going to be here. And for what it's worth, I don't have a degree in computer science, so the way that I got to where I am now just takes commitment, time, and reading all of Aaron Verdum's Bitcoin Magazine articles. But before we look at those tools, I want to make sure that everyone is on the same page about Bitcoin basics like Bitcoin as in the unit, what are transactions, and what are unspent transaction outputs, or UTXOs. And it's really important to understand those terms in this section and how they relate to one another, because they will appear in pretty much all of the tools that we will be exploring. And it's easy to get lost in them if you don't first grasp the vocabulary that they use. So first of all, is everyone pretty familiar with what the units are in Bitcoin in terms of an economic supply perspective? So this is just a refresher slide. Rounded up, there will only be 21 million Bitcoin. Each of those coins can be subdivided into 100 million Satoshis, which is the smallest on-chain unit. And then on the Lightning Network, the smallest unit is currently millisatoshis, and there are 100 billion millisatoshis in a Bitcoin. So in total, in terms of working currency, there are quadrillions of units of value. So what is a Bitcoin transaction? Now, the previous answer with the units really only addresses what is a Bitcoin from an economic perspective. But then how does Bitcoin move around on the blockchain? When you transact in Bitcoin, you're essentially passing along a wide variety of sizes of chunks of Bitcoin. You can think of it this way. With $1, you have quarters, dimes, nickels, and pennies, which is a very static variety of cent chunks. And you can also have chunks of dollars in the form of $5 bills, $10 bills, $20 bills, etc. Whereas with Bitcoin, you can have 1 Bitcoin, 2 Bitcoin, 0.1 Bitcoin, 1.12 Bitcoin, 1.123 Bitcoin, 1.1234 Bitcoin, and so on, any combination of numbers down to 8 decimal places. and even further if you're going into millisatoshis. And these chunks of Bitcoin are called unspent transaction outputs, and they are controlled by addresses which are tied to a private-public key pair. And the private key is what allows you to sign for a transaction, allowing them to be spent and move along to new addresses. And what a lot of newbies to Bitcoin don't know is that one person can not only have multiple addresses in one wallet, but they can be using multiple wallets, and they can be different wallets. So each address in a wallet is like a collection of UTXO, and from these collections of chunks of Bitcoin, your wallet software will calculate and display a balance like this. So to make this easier to visualize, imagine that each address is kind of like a pocket in the wallet, and that pocket can contain a practically infinite combination of chunks of Bitcoin represented by the little yellow circles with values on them. And when you're looking at a particular address in something like a block explorer, which is basically a browser for blockchain data, each address will appear to have its own balance, and this is because it is not obvious that a particular address belongs to a particular wallet with other addresses unless, of course, you transact in ways that cluster them together. But when you're looking at your own addresses in your own wallet or through your full node, it will usually calculate a total wallet balance of all those addresses. And this wallet balance is essentially the amount of Bitcoin that's spendable by the private keys in your wallet. And there are three main types of transactions. The first type is a common transaction because it is the most frequently occurring type. And a common transaction consists of one input and two outputs. So the wallet on the left, wallet A, is spending a 1 Bitcoin chunk from address. It ran out of battery. Okay. So the wallet on the left is spending a 1 Bitcoin chunk from address 1, and it's transferring it to address 1 in the second wallet. But let's say that the person spending from wallet A on the left only wants to send half a Bitcoin to wallet B. What happens? Well, wallet A will split the 1 Bitcoin chunk into 2 chunks, and half will go to address 1 and the wallet B on the right, and the other half will return to a change address, an empty address or pocket back in the wallet on the left. So technically wallet A could actually not specify a particular change address at all, and most wallets today will automatically generate one for you, but in this case, to visualize it, I specify that it be sent to a new address 4. This is the second type of transaction, which is called an aggregating transaction, and that means that there are multiple possible inputs merged together as one, or at least, that multiple inputs are merged into one output or fewer outputs than one. Fewer outputs. So wallet A could aggregate chunks of Bitcoin from 3 different addresses, altogether equaling 3.86 Bitcoin, which is sent to the second address in the wallet on the right. But because that wallet already has a 3 Bitcoin chunk in address 1, then the total balance of that wallet would obviously be 6.86. And to give an example of this, this is one of the most famous aggregating transactions. It has a staggering 131 inputs and 1 output, and at least in this portion of the screenshot, you can see that all of the inputs also come from the same address, which means address reuse. And so this is a famous transaction. Does anyone... Okay, then. So does anyone know what this famous transaction is? Yep. So this transaction was made on May 22nd. The amount is 10,000 Bitcoin. And yes, it was the famous Bitcoin pizza transaction where a guy named Laszlo bought 2 pizzas for 10,000 Bitcoin, which at the time was worth, don't cry, about $30. Most people who look at this think, damn, 10,000 Bitcoin. And I look at this and I think, address reuse, and merged inputs. And so let's move on to the last one, which is distributing transactions. And this means that there is one input that can be split into smaller output chunks, or basically any transaction where there's fewer inputs than outputs. And so in this example, the wallet on the left has split a 1 Bitcoin chunk into 4 pieces of 0.25, which are each sent to different addresses. And this is a simplified visualization, so you should keep in mind that it's also possible to have a distributing transaction that goes to addresses in more than one wallet, including back into your own as change. And those were some really rushed visualizations that I put together, but if you want some more examples, there's a really great one by Patricia and Marco from Bitcoin Explained that talks about UTXOs and privacy. And this is not an exhaustive list. The exhaustive list was the one that Renee did in one of his lightning sessions, but you have probably concluded by now that transaction data will include things like the data format version number, the number of inputs and outputs, lists of those specific inputs and outputs, and whether the spending conditions have been satisfied. And if your transaction has a time lock enabled, then it will also have a specific block number or a timestamp, which will tell you when those funds become spendable again in the future. And at this point, it would also be relevant to note that wallets handle certain data structures and fields differently, which may allow someone to figure out what wallet software generated a particular transaction. And in some cases where you are sending a payment with a script or address format that is different from what is used in the change output, or you use a wallet that always orders the change output second or last if you have more than 2, then it's even easier to make reasonable predictions about the movement of funds. Unfortunately, most wallets hide the actual transaction metadata from you, so you can't, it's hard for the average user to identify what their wallet is doing, whether they may be using techniques that result in fingerprinting. So we haven't quite reached the section on analysis heuristics, but something I really like about blockstream.info, a block explorer, is that if you open up the transaction details there, they actually have a privacy analysis section that will tag transactions as having conformed to this or that heuristic. For example, in this one you have, I can't actually see from this angle, you have rounded payment amounts, mixed script types, and unnecessary input heuristics, and we'll go into some of those later, but I think that's really useful because I haven't seen any other block explorer do that, or at least not one that does it in that way. And so if you want to learn more about what particular heuristics are appearing in certain transactions or what they conform to, then it's really easy to do some research using this explorer, and then you can learn more about what they look like. And so that concludes the Bitcoin basics review of the concepts that will appear over and over again as we look at some of the on-chain and off-chain attacks that can compromise your privacy, as well as the privacy-enhancing tools that will help you thwart them. And I just want to say that when I say on-chain attack, I'm simply referring to an attack regarding data or activities that is directly recorded in the Bitcoin blockchain and is available to everyone accessing the network. Whereas off-chain attacks are those that are not necessarily based on the blockchain data, but rather data from ancillary activities, which may be collected by various parties. Some of this data may be available to everyone. For example, if you have a social media profile and you frequently post about your Bitcoin activities. But for the most part, it's selectively collected data based on the services that you use. But instead of just listing off some available tools and what they do, I'm going to present them alongside some fictional characters that are representative of people who may need to use them in order to protect themselves against various types of attackers. And our first character is Bob the Whistleblower. In short, Bob is a mid-level manager at a Silicon Valley tech company. I don't know how many of you can identify with that position, but one day he's given a directive by upper management to draw up a project plan for integrating some analytics software into their product, and this analytics software comes from a firm that they just partnered with. And the executives stress the importance of keeping said partnership confidential only on a need-to-know basis within the company. But Bob is a curious person, and because he hasn't heard of this firm before, he wants to know more. However, he does vaguely recognize the name of the firm's CEO. So while Bob is visiting a local library with his daughter Alice, he uses one of the terminals to look up the name of the CEO, and he finds page after page of search results linking to years-old articles that exposed how the CEO's previous company had hacked journalists and activists around the world on behalf of authoritarian governments, with no evidence that they ever tried to make amends for those actions. And so Bob is someone who cares about the safety of his customers, and he's completely opposed to, standing aside as this potentially harmful guy is allowed to possibly inflict damage on people that he's responsible for, and so after much thought, he decides to become a whistleblower. And by the way, I'd just like to state that this story is a work of fiction, except for the parts that aren't, and any resemblance between characters, actual or virtualized, may or may not be intended, and you may or may not be able to find all of those articles there, actually on the web, by searching in a privacy-preserving search engine like DuckDuckGo or something like that. But Bob needs to hold his horses for a bit longer, because if he jumps straight into the realm of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, he first needs to make sure that several general weaknesses in his browsing hygiene are patched. Since Bob is going to be whistleblowing on his employer, he needs to consider whether the hardware and firmware he uses is being remotely monitored by his company. Because a lot of companies will buy devices and phones and laptops for their employees with remote monitoring software enabled. Hint, hint, Windows. He needs to consider also what web browsers and search engines he should use, and whether his usage might be tracked, such as for enabling advertising systems that may pass along that data to data brokers, which are everywhere. And if he's going to be communicating sensitive information to lawyers, information security experts, or journalists, he should look into using encrypted email and messaging applications. And if the volume of the documents he wants to share is very large, he'll need to look at good DNS and VPS providers that will preserve his privacy as much as possible. And these privacy-enhancing options in all of these areas can be found at a very nice website called privacytools.io. And you may have noticed the bolded option at the bottom. How many of you in this room use Google for almost everything? That includes Android phones, Chrome browser, Google search engine, Gmail, Google Drive for documents, presentations, spreadsheet, and calendars. Well, then the last bullet is for you, because every one of those things I just mentioned, there is a non-Google alternative. Be free of the Google. And Bob, as many people are, they're vaguely aware of what VPNs are, but like many people, he is also extremely confused about which one to use. So another useful resource is That One Privacy site, which is written by, you guessed it, That One Privacy guy, which compares VPN services and applications across the world based on characteristics like jurisdiction, whether they log traffic or connection requests, the payment options they offer, like Bitcoin, and how reasonable the pricing is, such as, or as well as various security features and configuration options that are important for securely using a VPN. But just as a reminder, if you're familiar with the phrase, there is no cloud, just someone else's computer, then you should also remember that for the most part, VPNs are just another ISP. They do not make you anonymous, and they provide little to no protection against mass surveillance by nation states, but they can be useful in terms of simply not divulging your real IP address to every single website and service you use. And in Bob's case, as a corporate whistleblower, that tool may be enough for him in his case. So the Wirecutter has also recently published their own analysis of VPN services with a preference towards the usability of them and the regulatory frameworks in which they are based for consumer protection, rather than geopolitical considerations like is this country one of the 14 I's? So that may be more useful to you in your circumstance. But if you're in need of anonymity, you need to look at something like the Tor browser. And if any of you would be interested or have plans to travel to Europe in the next week or so, there's actually going to be a meetup in Berlin specifically about building secure file distribution systems. And I know the people running it, and if you think that sounds scary and you would never be able to do that, they teach people all the time who have never even touched the command line, so you have nothing to worry about. The other thing that Bob realizes is that when it comes to privacy standards across multiple levels, hardware, software, et cetera, mobile phones suck. They don't make good identifiers or second factors because you don't really control your number at all. The average telecommunications staff member is 10 times more socially engineerable than your grandma, who is constantly forwarding you those very generous offers from Nigerian princes. Or more recently, that ICO that's full of more hot air than baby Trump balloons. But there's a really good blog post by the Kraken Exchange that explains how you can secure your telco accounts against some of the attack vectors, like switching to better 2FA alternatives like authenticator apps, or even small hardware devices like a YubiKey, which is basically looks like a USB stick. And even better, you can trade in that highly socially engineerable customer service for one that isn't, pointing to Google Fi, simply because they can't be socially engineered if they can't help you at all because they're not there. And if you're curious about what really bad misconceptions the average person has about mobile phone security, I actually wrote a blog post about that a few years ago. Apparently, a large portion of the population is under the impression that phones have no intermediaries and they're peer-to-peer, which is great news from a philosophical standpoint if you want to get peer-to-peer technology adopted, but it's not great from, actual privacy and security. And along the way, you will probably encounter some services that will actually require a phone number and you can't get around it. And so if you need to, usually you will need some way to receive and send text messages. And luckily, there are services like SMS Privacy and Number Proxy that will allow you to set up temporary virtual or physical numbers for that purpose, and they take Bitcoin. And now we've gotten to the exciting part, exchanges. So Bob has taken some steps now towards patching general privacy weaknesses, but of course, as a newbie, if you go around asking crypto people where or how they should get Bitcoin, the most common answer is some sort of exchange, their favorite one. The problem is most fiat to crypto exchanges are not only custodial, which means you don't control your keys as Satoshi intended, but they often have pages and pages dedicated to sucking up as much personal information as possible, including name, date of birth, email, phone number, home address, state-issued identification, bank account details, and more recently, selfies, which clearly does not work here. This process of requiring personally identifying information from your customers is broadly termed Know Your Customer KYC. And if you study privacy-enhancing technologies regarding cryptocurrencies a lot, or oppositely, regulatory compliance, you will hear that term a lot. And if you looked at the scheduled information for the session, you may have noticed that a suggested prerequisite was to make a list of the services you use with Bitcoin at some point today, or maybe after the conference, when you are back in the comfort of your own home. I highly recommend that when you do that, you do a self-audit of which services you use, and also figure out what personal information that they have taken from you. It's really important to know this in the event that there is, for example, a change in ownership at that company, or a hack, or some other event that could impact their storage and sharing policies for your personal information. And if you thought that list that I provided earlier was all they were collecting, think again. This is a screenshot from the privacy policy of Coinbase, which, in addition to the things I already listed, they also collect your age, gender, utility bills, tax ID, visa information, transaction history, office location, job title, geolocation details, browser fingerprint, operating system, on and on. So Bob is not too enthusiastic about that. Especially when Bob is aware in other cases of some troubling stories, such as the fallout from the Quadriga CX exchange, where it was discovered that one of the co-founders had a history of credit and bank card fraud. And the idea that this kind of person could have accessed highly sensitive personal information and financial details of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people should be absolutely terrifying. And so some of you might say, before this, I've looked into the exchanges I use, I know who runs them, and they're good people. I trust them not to do something like that. And that may be absolutely true. They may be perfectly nice people. But I would say to you, have you read their privacy policy? Have you read the clause which says they may also share data with subsidiaries or other companies that they partner with? They may share it in the event of an acquisition or takeover. Can you guarantee the trustworthiness of all future partners and acquirers that you don't even know about yet? And I would say no. Luckily, custodial exchanges are not the only option. The two ones that are probably the most popular in the peer-to-peer Bitcoin exchange space that I am aware of are Hodl Hodl and Bisq. You may remember Bisq, if you've been around a while, as BitSquare a few years ago. And both of them require very minimal or no personally identifying information if you are trading crypto to crypto, unless there is a dispute that arises. And if you're trading fiat to crypto and don't opt for meeting in person, you'd obviously need to give your trading partner enough information to allow them to make a wire transfer of some sort. But that's not shared with Bisq. In the case of Bisq, it's not shared with them as an entity because Bisq has no entity, and they don't need that information. And Hodl Hodl is based in Latvia, and they're a peer-to-peer exchange in terms of the service they offer. But in their terms of service, they actually say that they don't allow American residents or citizens to use their platform. Allow in quotes because, well, if they can't even tell that you're a dog, how are they going to tell that you're an American? And then there's Bitcoin ATMs. How many of you in here have tried to use or watched someone else use a Bitcoin ATM before? So I think it's important to point out that ATMs come in two main forms. There are the one-way ATMs that are more like vending machines or teller services because you only really have the option to buy the Bitcoin with cash or sometimes with card, but you can't sell. And then there's the other form of ATM, which is more like a real ATM in that it is two-way. You can either buy or sell. And the personal information requested by these machines will vary a lot depending on whether you are buying or selling, what jurisdiction you're in, and what the amount is. And in this way, ATMs can be roughly split into three groups in terms of the personal information they collect. There are ATMs that require full KYC, and by that I mean some form of state-issued photo identification, your name and home address, et cetera, things like that. Sometimes if the amount is high enough, they will even ask you to fill out a survey stating what your intentions are with the Bitcoin you have purchased. I have seen a few of those in Denver, by the way. And then there are the ATMs I have dubbed KYC Lite, which means that they do require some pieces of information that could be used to identify you, but those pieces can be easily spoofed or used temporarily, and therefore you can avoid identifying yourself if you want to. This would include something like a name field without, proof of identity or a phone number or an email address. And then there are ATMs that actually don't do any KYC and can only know anything about you based on whatever information you divulge with your spending patterns that are connected to the address you give them when you take Bitcoin in or out. And this is not necessarily because these ATMs are in a jurisdiction that don't do KYC, but because their businesses have qualified for a relatively high minimum transaction amount below which they are not required to identify their customers. Now, the fact that such machines exist may be a surprise to Americans who haven't been outside of the US because, as far as I could tell, the Bitcoin services around the Denver area are all full KYC ATMs, even if you're buying less than $100. Since Bob the whistleblower is in the US, ATMs may not then be a good option for him if he wants to stay truly private and anonymous, but maybe he's willing to travel abroad or alternatively find someone to trade with at one of the many Bitcoin meetups around the world. Though I don't know about you, but there appears to be at least one meetup up there with Bob's name on it. And before Bob actually acquires some Bitcoin in any way that he chooses, he has to think about which wallet he will use to receive it. And he needs to ask himself questions like, who will hold the private keys to his coins? Who will run the node that provides him with the balances for his addresses? And who will broadcast the transactions that he makes? Towards the end of the presentation, I'll go over Dandelion, which covers broadcasting. But for maximum privacy, in terms of holding private keys and getting balances and broadcasting transactions, Bob should probably consider running a full node. And for anyone who doesn't know, a full node is basically a machine like a laptop computer or Raspberry Pi or a server that runs a consensus-compatible version of the Bitcoin software, and it independently validates transactions and blocks on the Bitcoin network and keeps a full copy of the Bitcoin blockchain. And why is running a full node important for privacy? Because you probably heard that it's important for censorship resistance and trustlessness. Chris Belcher wrote a really great article for the Bitcoin Wiki about full nodes, and he outlines 3 main benefits: trustlessness, security, and privacy. And he argues that privacy is a benefit because if you're sending Bitcoin or receiving Bitcoin through what is called a light client or light wallet, which is not a full node in itself and needs to rely on other nodes in order to perform those activities, you may be sharing all of the addresses that you own, all of the transactions you've ever made, and all of the unspent outputs that you have with that node that you're connecting to. And when you're using one of the hardware wallet apps, for example, even though your private keys are secure and isolated, that app that you use in your web browser is still querying the servers run by that company in order to display your balance within the app. And in fact, it's probably sharing what is called the XPub, or Master Extended Public Key. And if you've browsed around one of those apps before, you may have noticed that they have a section to export it, and it says with a little warning that you shouldn't share it with anyone you don't trust, because basically the XPub allows you to see all of the addresses derived from that key pair, and the XPub cannot be used to spend those funds, but it allows you to see all of the addresses that are derived from the public-private key pair. There are quite a few wallets that actually allow you to choose the nodes that you connect to. Some wallets like Electrum and Wasabi are compatible with hardware wallets as well, so you get the benefit of keeping your private keys secure, but you don't have to broadcast transactions through their app, which can expose your financial privacy. And Join Market that I listed there is a relatively advanced choice, so be aware of that if you're not familiar with using command line or Linux packages. There's also Samurai Wallet, which is an Android mobile wallet with a ton of on-chain privacy and anonymization features that we'll go into later. And they recently released a custom open source node software that is specifically designed to pair with their mobile wallet. And it's really cool because if you run the wallet, but you have family members, friends, or colleagues who are not able to run their own nodes, the Dojo software actually makes wallet pairing really easy. So your family members who are not as technical can use your node, which in some circumstances that may not be the best option, but it's a lot better than just using the Samurai Wallet service, which is which has received a lot of criticism in terms of privacy for that. But keep in mind, a lot of this stuff is still in the alpha stage in terms of development, but if you want to help build up the cutting edge of privacy features in Bitcoin, these are the kinds of projects you can help with. And even if you don't understand what most of the wallets are doing, that's actually helpful because you can tell them that, and then they will try to make it more usable and understandable. Of course, this wouldn't be a Bitcoin privacy talk without pointing out one of the primary adversaries, which is blockchain surveillance companies. And some of you may ask, why do I call them surveillance companies instead of analytics companies? And the answer to that question has to do with three key differences that I see between the two, even though they can be functionally identical, and that is intent, consent, and transparency. While both blockchain analysis and surveillance involve inspecting, identifying, clustering, and modeling data on the blockchain, those who engage in blockchain surveillance have the intent to de-anonymize for intelligence and law enforcement purposes, using data that is usually not obtained consensually or through a warrant, and using tools that are not transparent or open for everyone to use. In order to effectively combat this adversary, you need to know what their goals are and what their mode of attack is. And in blockchain surveillance, their goal is to create clusters of UTXOs, addresses, and wallets that are probably belonging to the same entities. Notice how I said probably, because what most blockchain analysis companies do is a matter of probability of weighing various possible interpretations against each other and guessing which real-world entities could be responsible for coin movements and why those movements are occurring. And over the years, they have established various heuristics, or in other words, assumptions that one could make based on certain transaction structures and spending patterns. These are just three examples of the common heuristics that you'll find in a lot of these algorithms. Common input co-spending, which basically says that all inputs to a transaction belong to the same person. Another one is the consumer heuristic, which says that if it's a wallet that has one input, two outputs, it's most likely from a consumer wallet, and consumer transactions tend to be the most common. And the last one is rounded numbers, because if your transaction is using rounded numbers in fewer decimal places, that probably means that was the payment, because most people don't like to write out 8 decimal places worth in a payment. And so the change output will likely be the one with the most decimal places and not a rounded number. So the solution is not only coin management in wallets, but also we need to start building wallets that are smart and it can actually warn you about whether you're making poor coin selection choices. I don't know if we want to do the pop quiz because we're a bit short on time, but if you want to look up this transaction, I'm going to only use one of the questions, but I'll give you 30 seconds to look up this transaction, and then I'm going to ask you whether it's a common transaction, an aggregating transaction, or a distributing transaction. And this transaction is in the slides, so you can copy it directly from there if you're on Sched. All right, so raise your hand if you think this transaction was a common transaction. Raise your hand if you think it was an aggregating transaction. I think I need to give you more time.
Raise your hand if you're still trying to type that in.
Bonus points if you're connecting to your own full node that is able to run through the Hyatt's Wi-Fi. So raise your hand. Common, aggregating, or distributing? It looks like it was aggregating, and that is the correct answer. It was an aggregating transaction because it had one out. Where did it go? Because it involved the merging of multiple outputs, in this case, 9 into one output. Yeah, limited on time now. But one of the really important things that's being developed right now, or is really popular among wallets, is called CoinJoin. And 2 of the wallets, there's actually 3 wallets that are implementing this, but the 2 desktop wallets are Wasabi and Join Market. And they have some interesting differences in how they actually handle the mixing process. I think I've mentioned this already, but one of the important things to do when you're looking at blockchain explorer websites is not only to use Tor, and in the instance of blockstream.info, you can actually use their Onion service, which means it's actually built to run over Tor. But something you have to remember that they don't remind you is that when you're querying addresses or transactions, blockstream.info could still technically say, well, this is an anonymous person, but this anonymous person looked at these addresses, and so I don't know who they are, but most likely these addresses are correlated together. So what you have to do when you're looking at blockchain explorers over Tor is you have to change your circuit, and then when you're done using it, you also have to change your identity. So we have gotten to the end of Bob's story, and so let's say he's gone through the things that I recommended, which includes buying new devices, and also after buying Bitcoin from someone at a meetup, he also uses CoinJoin so that even the meetup attendee who helped him cannot follow where the coins go. And I just want to say, even though I've used a whistleblower use case, this is not a sufficient guideline for an actual whistleblower. This is just used for illustrative purposes. If you are an actual whistleblower, you should probably contact information security experts who can give you more individualized advice. And it's based on a real whistleblower. The story is inspired by a real whistleblower, Edward Snowden, because actually in 2 occasions where he was speaking at conferences, he actually mentioned that he used Bitcoin to buy the servers that were able to help him transfer the documents to journalists. So if he was confident enough to use Bitcoin for that purpose, granted he ended up becoming a public figure, he's also going to be publishing a book soon, Permanent Record, and he will probably give more details, hopefully, on how he used Bitcoin. Unfortunately, because time is a bit short, I'm going to skip the second use case, which is Alice, which is his daughter, fictional character again. And her use case is that she wants to just be able to use services as a kid. Most services online, especially financial applications, don't allow children to use money, which is unfortunate because as it doesn't make sense to wait to use money until you're 18 years old. And so she may want to experiment with things like the Lightning Network and various features in Samurai Wallet, which, and OpenDime as well, off-chain transactions that allow her to protect her privacy for her use case when she is earning Bitcoin from various entities online. Paynims are also really cool because basically they're reusable payment codes that you can give out, and most people just give out a donation address, but the problem with that is everyone who sees that donation address can then see how much money was donated to it. But if you use something like a paynim, a new address is generated automatically for every donation that's made, and so the only person who can see the donation is the person who made it, and obviously you and the addresses can't be correlated together as long as you're using the wallet properly. If you want to know about the privacy aspects of the Lightning Network, there's other sessions that not only explain how it works, but specifically Renee tomorrow is going to be talking about onion routing on Lightning, if you want to know more about that, because that's important for transaction privacy and an interesting use case. So I'm going to skip to, this is basically just Alice using various features. Some of them are also regarding off-chain attacks, like someone looking over your shoulder, and maybe you don't want people around you to know that you use a Bitcoin wallet on your phone, but you still want to use your phone in public. So you are able to hide the app from your home screen, and if you want to make it appear again, you can just type in a code into the dial screen, and then it will reappear on your phone when you want to use it again. Phones suck. SIM swapping is a big problem, and unfortunately, to mention Google again, some of the features in Samurai Wallet that protected privacy and security were disabled because Google decided to be more restrictive in their policies and not make an exemption for Samurai Wallet. So if you have any influence at Google, you should tell them that SIM swapping is a big problem and it's not going to go away, and it's not just about financial privacy, it's also about people who can be in physical danger, because there's a use case in terms of the SIM switch defense where if someone is trying to SIM switch you, the Samurai Wallet would actually alert you that the SIM card details related to your wallet have changed. They will send a text message to your trusted number, and so that's a way that many people have actually been alerted to SIM swapping regardless of whether they cared about the Bitcoin in their wallet. And this is a really great privacy guide if you want to know a lot more about the attacks and solutions to various privacy problems in Bitcoin. A lot of them that I mentioned are already today are in there, and there's a lot more. Not going to go too much into the future upgrades because they're not things that you can currently use, but you should just keep them in mind. Dandelion routing has to do with broadcasting privacy. So instead of doing the flood broadcasting, which is the standard that most Bitcoin nodes do, it will actually have the transaction that you're broadcasting go through various hops and then burst like a dandelion seed. So that obscures the origin of a transaction, because if someone has tried to analyze the Bitcoin network and connect to a lot of nodes, they might be able to figure out that if a transaction originated from a particular node, then that person most likely was the one who made the transaction. Taproot, also important, has smart contract-like capabilities that will come, and it also, the way that it's designed, it will, it's called Taproot because it will basically create a tree structure of spending conditions, and unless you use those spending paths, they're otherwise hidden, and they can be indistinguishable from standard on-chain transactions. And Schnorr signatures as well, you've probably heard of that. And some people may say that privacy coins have solved a lot of the problems that Bitcoin is trying to deal with now, but that's actually not the case. They've just made certain trade-offs that have affected other parts of their system, like its censorship resistance, or the ability for scalability and things like that. So I would dissuade you from thinking that just because a coin is called a privacy coin, that means it actually provides substantial privacy. I'm going to skip to the fun part, because this is a lot about different analysis algorithms. This is a cool blockchain explorer that really gives you a lot of detail about inputs and outputs and how they might be linked probabilistically. And it gives you also the scripts that are used, and so that can alert you to the mixed script problem that I mentioned earlier, where it can help you identify the change address. So this is the fun part. So many of you may not know this, but Chainalysis, one of the blockchain surveillance companies, actually does webinars. And they are open to the public. Anyone can watch them, but the videos after they air are not published anywhere as far as I know. I'm actually friends with the developer of Wasabi Wallet, and one of his favorite activities is actually to attend these Chainalysis webinars and report back what they say. And so those are links to various times where he's actually reported on the webinars. And something really interesting that they said in the last one, it was a Chainalysis researcher, and she said that they can identify funds going into mixing services like Wasabi, but for the most part, they can generally not trace them out, which is a big deal, because that was a similar thing that a supposed Chainalysis current or former employee said in an AMA that he held on Reddit, obviously anonymously, and then he later deleted everything because he realized that was probably too risky. One of the interesting things he said is that one of their main clients was the CIA through In-Q-Tel, and In-Q-Tel was actually one of the funders of the software that went into Google Maps. So this is a chart that I created of some of the, naming the CEO, the funding sources, and the clients of some really popular blockchain surveillance companies. You may have noticed that a lot of them say intelligence agencies. Well, the one that's quite interesting, Chainalysis, in one of their webinars, this is not something that usually happens, that they name their clients, but they actually did. And so some of their clients are BitPay, Bitstamp, Binance, and Corebit. So that was an unusual circumstance that I don't know if they were even allowed to do that. And just recently, actually yesterday, I saw this tweet that Chainalysis also has contracts with ICE since 2016. And this is another bunch of exchanges, or not exchanges, blockchain surveillance companies. Neutrino is on the list. You may have not heard of them, but they were acquired by Coinbase. If any of you are on Bitcoin Twitter, I am the person who was one of the people who was majorly behind the whole delete Coinbase thing. So as far as we know, the people that were from Hacking Team, which was the company that inspired an earlier story in the presentation, they supposedly left Coinbase after that whole fiasco, but we don't actually know. Giancarlo Russo was the CEO of Neutrino. Don't know where he's gone now because their website is still up and it still says we've been acquired by Coinbase, so no idea where they've went. And to end the presentation, one of the things that my MC said in a recent talk was that we should institute, we should be careful about hiring people who come from these companies because they have exhibited moral bankruptcy, similar to how we should be careful about people who have bad credit scores. The problem with that is there's a lot of monitoring of people's credit and their activities in relation to that may affect their credit score. There's not a lot of data about, or there's not an easy way to look at who actually works at these blockchain surveillance companies. So I'm going to make that process a lot easier, and I'm going to create an archive called Blockchain Surveillance Watch that collects documents and profiles of these people. Because I think, in the interest of transparency, we should know more about what they're doing, because that's their business. So it's not live yet, but it's going to be at some point.